Hey guys, today I'm going to be going over Psychology A-Level revision, and this is for the AQA exam board. Just so you know, the revision videos, I've made them all based off of my booklets and my own revision. I'm just sharing this to help other people. But yeah, just to say, I'm not doing every single Psychology A-Level topic, so if you can't find yours listed, that's why. I'm only doing my ones that I'm doing in the actual exam. This is an overview of what is in each paper for me. And firstly, we're going to be looking at paper one. And today's video will be on social influence. So there are three different types of conformity. So there is compliance, to publicly conform with the majority to gain approval by the majority group whilst privately disagreeing. So this is where you don't necessarily agree, but you're pretending to. And our behaviour and thinking is only superficial when we're being monitored. So when the group we want to be a part of is there, we're agreeing with their views, but privately, we disagree. Identification is to publicly conform by agreeing on views because there's something about a certain group that we respect and want to belong to. And you could publicly change behaviour regardless of agreement just to be part of the group. And internalization is when we publicly and privately conform by taking on views of the majority, and we agree with the views on a personal level and see them as correct. So, internalization is where we genuinely do agree with the views, but compliance and identification, we don't actually agree, it's on a superficial level. There are two explanations as to why we conform. First, we've got normative social influence. And this is where humans fear rejection and have a fundamental need for social acceptance. And this results in us publicly following the majority group norms, even if we don't really agree with them privately. Although we don't agree with the group, our priority is simply to fit in and to avoid being outcast or seen as foolish or abnormal. And this is an emotional response. Informational social influence is a cognitive response to being unsure about something, and humans also have a fundamental need to be correct. When we're insecure about what we think or believe, such as in ambiguous, new, or unfamiliar situations, we look to others to inform or guide us. And this may also happen during a crisis or when we perceive others to be more expert in that situation. So maybe, say, for example, in a fire, we might look to someone who's been in a fire before for help because we think that they're more experienced with the situation than us. So this is the evaluation for conformity. In support of informational social influence, a study by Lucas et al. Asked students to answer easy and difficult math questions. They found a higher level of conformity amongst students giving the incorrect answers to difficult questions compared to the easy questions. This was especially true for students who rated their mathematical ability as poor. So the students that weren't confident in their math skills cheated more than the students that were confident in their math skills. And Lucas claims that the study has shown high levels in conformity in situations where people are unsure of their ability and lack confidence. So we can clearly see that that links to informational social influence. In support of normative social influence, NSI has also been used successfully to manipulate people into behaving more responsibly when it comes to energy conservation. I don't quite know how to say this name. I think it's Scholes. I don't know. Scholes et al. Found that hotel guests exposed to the message that 75% of guests reuse their towels each day reduced their own towel use by 25% more than when they were asked to just do so for conservation reasons. So it just goes to show that we kind of copy other people. If we have the idea that other people are doing it, it feels like we should be doing it too. But in criticism of both ISI and NSI, there are individual differences, and people have seen different levels of conformity, and it varying across research for different reasons, such as levels of confidence, intelligence, and education. And I haven't written it here, but this is also very ethnocentric research. So that just means it hasn't been carried out in other cultures. It's just been westernized research. One of the key studies we have to know is Ash's study into conformity, and this is imperative that we know this for the exam. So Ash wanted to investigate the degree that people conform in the opinion of others, even when the answer is quite certain. That was his aim. So he set up a room for participants to make some judgments on some visual tasks that they believe were to do with investigating perspective. So the participants were deceived in the aim so that they can work out that it was actually about conformity. Ash showed them cards with lines on and asked participants which line, A, B, or C, was the best match to the line marked X. And one naive participant was amongst Confederates that were told to give the wrong answer. The naive participant was placed second from last to ensure they had heard most Confederates give their answer first. So it was one naive participant placed second to last or last, and then the rest were Confederates. So there were 7 people in total. In the findings, they found that 75% of all naive participants conformed at least once, and across all trials, the conformity level was 37%. When interviewed after the trials, the participants claimed they conformed to avoid standing out and risking rejection, and that obviously links back to normative social influence. In variations of the study, group size increased conformity to 31% when in groups of 3. However, further increases made little difference. He concluded only 3 people were needed to influence someone. And unanimity, so Ash tested to see if a non-conforming Confederate would affect the conformity of a naive candidate. And when the Confederate didn't conform, the naive candidate's conformity dropped to 5%. And task difficulty, Ash made the lines closer in length, thus making it more difficult to establish which line was closer to X, and the conformity levels rose. And this is because the naive candidate will use ISI, as surely all these people aren't wrong, using that mindset, and if they're right so far, surely they're not now. So, here's some evaluation of Ash's study. As I mentioned before with the NSI and ISI explanations, it is ethnocentric and ungeneralizable, as Ash's research only used white American men, and these people would be part of an individualist culture where people are more concerned and focused on themselves rather than their social group. So people work a lot more independently than as a group, and it's suggesting that in collective cultures like Eastern cultures like China, there's a lot more conformity because they have this collectivist culture where the group works together. Another criticism is that Ash only used male participants, so it's quite androcentric research. Other research suggests that women may be more conformist due to an evolutionary adaptation of being more focused on their affiliation of social groups, finding strength for social cohesion and group membership. This study also lacks temporal validity, as Ash's findings may reflect only the norms of the time. The study was conducted in America in the 1950s, which was during the Cold War, and this was a time where conformity was normal. American ways were celebrated and protected. So there was an inherent fear of attitudes and behavior deemed to be different or non-American. This is where the ideas of the American dream are really prevalent, and the idea of being really patriotic and American was really important to a lot of people, and we still see it today in that American culture. Another really important key study that we have to know is Zimbardo's study into conformity. So Zimbardo wanted to investigate the way we might conform to expectations that we believe come with various roles that we perform in society. So it's the idea that how we view maybe a stereotypical police officer based off of media, TV, and the news, we use those behaviours that we perceive come with that role. Zimbardo set up a mock prison in the basement of Stanford University, and recruited 24 white middle-class undergraduate students using a volunteer sample. And that's just where the participants volunteered themselves to do the study. All participants were interviewed and background screened before the study. They were all non-criminals and assessed as normal male college students. They didn't have any, mental disorders or anything like that. They were all considered to be very healthy. The participants were randomly allocated into the role of prison guard or prisoner, and he had the prisoner students arrested in their own homes and brought in by real police officers, so it makes it a lot more realistic. The prisoners remained in the mock prison and they were heavily guarded for 24 hours a day. Prisoners' names weren't used and numbers were given instead, so this is very dehumanizing. The guards worked an 8-hour shift, allowing them to return home afterwards. So they were actually allowed to leave the experiment day to day. The guards were told that they had complete power over the prisoners and that they were to maintain order within the prison. Maintain order, it doesn't say anything about violence, so it's really interesting to see how these people just decided that prison guards were violent and aggressive due to the media and their perception of what prison guards do. The guards always performed their task in groups of 3, and that's interesting because in Ash's study we see that it only takes 3 people for someone to conform. Zimbardo regularly monitored the progress via cameras and a video screen outside of the prison. The guards wore mirrored sunglasses, so again, there's no eye contact between guards and prisoners, making it more easy to do dehumanizing behavior. They wore a khaki shirt, trousers, handcuffs, a nightstick, and a whistle. And the prisoners had a stocking cap, a smock, an ID number, no underwear, rubber sandals, and a chain and lock around their ankles. So it's very dehumanizing and, vulnerable. So Zimbardo found that all participants very quickly fell into their role. The guards harassed the prisoners. They tortured them through sleep deprivation, degradation, and derived of human rights. One of the prisoners' reality became so blurred he asked for parole instead of leaving the experiment. He forgot that this actually wasn't a real prison scenario. And Zimbardo became immersed in his own role in superintendent, and it took another person using an intervention to remind him that the experiment should be stopped. So his own ethics and moral compass was kind of set off, really. Like he just forgot about his own morals because he was so involved in this role. There are some very obvious problems with this research, like ethics, but I'm just going to talk about other ones first. So this study has really low internal validity due to the demand characteristics seen from participants. Some of them argue that the participants were play acting up to the cameras and fulfilling stereotypes they had learnt from TV and films. And evidence to support this is that one of the guards claimed to have played a character like one he had seen in a recent blockbuster film called Cool Hand Luke. So, demand characteristics, low internal validity. Another criticism, obviously, ethical boundaries. This one's really important. And this was caused by Zimbardo being the lead researcher and the prison superintendent. And he became so immersed in that role that it affected his judgments as a researcher. However, a silver lining here is that this did lead to the improvement of research and ethical guidelines. The guidelines we use now were written to ensure the protection of participants of future psychological research and to ensure that they wouldn't suffer as those did in Zimbardo's study. A good support is that it has really high external validity, as it was compared to later real-life torture and abuse that happened at the Abu Ghraib military prison in Iraq. And a bit of context here that you can include. In 2003, US military reserve guards were prosecuted for the abuse and torture they had inflicted on prisoners there. He argued that the behaviour of the guards at Abu Ghraib reflects the behaviour demonstrated by the situational factors, like poor training, boredom, and no accountability to a higher authority, leading them to misuse power. I forgot to put this in there, but the guards at the Abu Ghraib prison were similarly told to just, manage the prisoners. They were never told to use violence. And if you read up more about it, it really is like discussing the things that the guards did to the prisoners, sort of unprovoked, and they were never asked to do that. Another really key study that we need to know is Milgram's study into obedience, so not conformity, obedience. He wanted to investigate why the German soldiers were so obedient to Hitler and the SS during the Nazi campaign when ordered to perform such atrocities. So he used this study as a way to kind of see an explanation for how these people could be so blindly violent. In one room was the naive participant, and they were given the role of the teacher and the leader of the experiment. And on the other side of that wall was a Confederate who was the learner and supposedly taking a test. And for every answer that they got wrong, the naive participant or their teacher was told to shock them. And for every wrong answer, the voltage was labelled stronger and they were told to do the next level. Towards the higher voltages, the Confederate was told to start screaming, and at the highest one, go silent. And the leader gave simple prods to the naive participant teacher, such as the experiment requires that you continue. If they, protest or said, I don't want to do it. So the findings of this experiment, all participants went up to at least 300 volts when the Confederates were screaming and then silent, ignore the spelling error, and 65% delivered the maximum 450 volts when the Confederates were completely silent. And here are the variations of the study. We could be asked a question about this, sort of. So, location. Obedience was reduced to 48% when the study was moved to a downtown office instead of like a lab classroom setting. Proximity. Obedience was reduced to 40% when the teacher and learner were in the same room. Another one for proximity. Obedience reduced to 30% when the teacher had to force the learner's hand onto the shock plate. So this is just very aggressive, so I think more people wouldn't have wanted to do that. And another proximity one is obedience was reduced to 20.5% when the experimenter left the room and gave the teacher instructions on the phone. So that shows that proximity is quite important in obedience. Uniform. Obedience reduced to 20% when the experimenter wore casual clothing, jeans, instead of a lab coat. And allies, obedience was reduced to 10% when given two stooge teachers. So there were three teachers, and two of them were Confederates or stooges who would protest and say to the leader of the experiment, we're not doing this, to see what the naive participant will do. Okay, so an evaluation of Milgram. This study has really low generalizability, as he only used men in his study. So again, this is androcentric, and so we can't generalize his results to the entire population. They can't be generalized to women. Eagley claimed that women are more easily influenced than men. But Brass have since replicated the study with women and found the same levels of obedience across both genders, showing that Milgram's results can be considered as reliable and can be generalized. So there's a few different points here. Another criticism is that Milgram's study has low internal validity. Researchers Orne and Holland argue that the participants weren't naive and they were playing along, thus demonstrating demand characteristics. However, if the participants weren't really fooled by the study, why did they show so much distress? They demonstrate internal conflict, which suggests that they thought the shocks were real. So again, there's like 2 points here that kind of contrast each other. However, a support of the study is that it has high external validity, shown by a researcher called Hoffling. He carried out a field study on nurses in a hospital. Dr. Smith, a stooge doctor or a Confederate, phones nurses at the hospital, a real hospital by the way, and asks them to see if they have a particular unknown drug. The maximum dosage is 10 milligrams, but the doctor asks the nurse to administer 20 milligrams instead. This wasn't a real drug, it was just like a sugar thing. Because obviously that would be really unethical, but yeah, this is just to see if the nurses would show obedience to like their superior, even though it's wrong. This breaks 3 hospital rules. The nurses aren't supposed to take instructions over the phone. They doubled the maximum dose, and it was an unauthorized medicine. They have no idea what it was. So 21 out of 22 nurses administered the drug. And one interview, the nurses said that they trusted the doctor as he would know best, and it would be the doctor's responsibility for the patient's reaction to the medication. So they believe that responsibility would be passed on to the person that gave them the orders. This leads on to our explanations for obedience. One of these is the agentic state. Naturally, humans are in an autonomous state, which is where we conduct our own behaviour and take all responsibility for our actions and consequences. But when we're given an order by a perceived authority, we go through the agentic shift to the agentic state, where we take these orders from authority and assume any responsibility for our actions passes to the person in charge, thus not affecting our positive self-image. So this is what the nurses showed in Hoffling's study. There are also binding factors. This can include politeness on the researcher's part, the participant wanting to uphold their original promise, and anticipation of awkwardness that would occur when withdrawing. Several adjustments in the participants' thinking occurred that helped them to maintain their relationship with the experimenter. The participant will use strategies like shifting responsibility to the victim or the authority. Maybe thinking things like, oh, well, the participant volunteered, or the researcher knows best. And these adjustments help the participant to keep their unwritten contract whilst reducing the strain of their moral conflict, just passing the blame, really. And there's also legitimacy of authority. From as early as childhood, we learn that certain people in certain positions hold authority, and that within a given context, these people will have been given the legitimate authority to exercise a certain amount of power in the interest of society functioning smoothly. So this is like police. From an early age, we've been taught that we should listen to the police's instructions and that they have authority over us. Because they want society to run smoothly. It's within our own best interests. And we're willing to give up our independence and hand over control to figures of authority that I think that's meant to say that we trust will exercise that authority appropriately using their knowledge and power responsibly. So, say for example, we trust that the police officer will be doing the right thing because of their role and because of what we've been taught from a young age that they do the right thing. So here's the evaluation. A support of the explanations for the obedience is that Plash and Schmidt showed a film of Milgram's study to students and asked who they felt was responsible for the harm to the learner. And the students blame the experimenter rather than the teacher, so the naive participant. The students also indicated that the responsibility fell with the experimenter because he was the authority of the situation. He was the expert because he was a scientist. So this is linking to the legitimacy of authority and the agentic shift. However, the agentic shift explanation fails to explain why not all of the participants obeyed. If all humans understand that legitimate authority figures are to be obeyed in the interests of society functioning, then why would only some people obey? So, for example, in Hoffling's study, 21 out of 22 people obeyed, but that's still one person that didn't. So it kind of fails to explain why people don't obey. The support of this study is that the legitimacy of authority explanation helps to explain how obedience can lead to real-life war crimes. Cameron and Hamilton argue that I think it's My Lai, I'm sorry if that's wrong, massacre can be understood in terms of the powerful hierarchy within military groups that demand soldiers to obey as part of their duty as a good soldier, and the importance that soldiers place on obeying a superior without question or dishonor. I mean, the most obvious other example I can think of is in Mulan, the Disney film, where, she like speaks out and says that she wants to fight, and they're like, why are you talking right now? Because they're meant to be silent, they're just meant to do as they're told. Another really important study, there's so many, is Adorno's study into obedience, and he studied the authoritarian personality. We'll get into what that means. So he created a questionnaire and gave it to over 2,000 middle-class Americans to investigate their personality and unconscious attitudes to other racial types and authoritarian principles. The questionnaire was called the F scale. The F stood for fascism and was designed to establish their level of fascism and authoritarianism. Adorno found that people that scored high on the F scale had these things in common. So this basically explains what authoritarianism and fascism is, kind of. So people were generally more contemptuous of the weak and less powerful people in society, but showed respect for strength, power, and authority status. They were conscious of their own and other status and showed excessive respect and civility to those of a higher status. They had a cognitive style whereby they clearly categorized people and used fixed, distinctive stereotypes, and he found a strong correlation between authoritarianism and prejudice. So this is just a more in-depth explanation of what the authoritarianism personality actually is. So some of their characteristics is that society requires a strong leader to overrule and submissive to authority, and they show extreme respect to their superiors. They disrespect or have contempt for people of lower status. They are inflexible to negotiation as uncertainty makes them uncomfortable. They often have controversial views on gender, race, and sexuality, and other things. That's just the most obvious ones. And that society is fragile and leaders need to enforce traditional views as rules and structure. This personality can come from harsh parenting in childhood, if they're raised with strict discipline, parents having the expectation of them being absolutely loyal, having really high standards, severe criticism, and conditional love. This is just the idea that the child will only be loved by their parent if they do something, or if they don't do something. It's conditional. So an evaluation of this, I haven't got anything good. There probably is something good about it, but I've only got 3 criticisms. So Adorno fails to explain the behaviour of a country's whole population. For example, in pre-war Germany, millions of people displayed obedient racist behaviour, so it's very unlikely that the whole population had an authoritarian personality. Social identity theory offers an alternative and more likely explanation for the anti-Semitic. I don't. Oh, have I spelled that wrong? Um, Explanation for the anti-Semitic nationalist views and attitudes held by the German people in the 1930s. Another criticism is Christie and Jehoda argue that the F scale is a politically biased interpretation of the authoritarian personality. Adorno emphasizes that the authoritarian personality is associated with right-wing attitudes. However, Jehoda points out that both extreme far-right and far left-wing ideologies have much in common. So it's basically these people are just arguing that they're kind of demonizing right-wing values, but obviously political values are a circle, not a line. Far right, and far left actually come to be pretty much the same thing. Another criticism is that this lacks generalizability, as Adorno only used men in his study, again, androcentric. This is a problem as women tend to be less obedient and would overall lower the number of estimated authoritarian personalities in modern society if they were included in the study. And women now stand up for their rights and don't believe in completely traditional values because of, the different waves of feminism and the new age feminism we have now. So, social support is another reason why people don't obey. It's a situational factor, and social support can help people resist the pressure to conform and to obey. For example, in Ash's study, having just one non-conforming Confederate breaks the unanimity of a majority group and allowed the participants to follow their own ideas, and conformity levels went from 37% to 5%. And another example in Milgram's study, a participant saw that a Confederate disobeyed the experimenter and experienced no consequences. So then the participant was confident enough to disobey too, and obedience levels went from 65% to 10%. So a support of this is shown with Allen and Levine study. They replicated Ash's experiment and found that conformity decreased when there was a dissenter placed amongst the group. That's someone who disagrees, basically a stooge or a Confederate. They tested to see if this would still be the case if the dissenter wore big, thick reading glasses, implying poor vision, and that they were smarter, kind of. I don't know. And the findings showed conformity to decrease even with less valid social support. Another support for this is that in 1943, a group of Jewish women protested to have 2,000 Jewish men released by the German Gestapo police. All the men were released and all women survived. They disobeyed by refusing to disperse and continuing to protest, although ordered not to by the Gestapo police, threatening to kill all of them. Yeah, because they had each other, more and more people joined to support the cause, and their strength in numbers. A dispositional factor is locus of control, and this can explain the sense of control people feel they have over their lives, whether it's controlled by internal or external forces. Researcher Rotter claimed that everyone can be placed somewhere on a continuum of internal locus of control or external locus of control by using his questionnaire, which identifies their beliefs regarding their perception of control and responsibility. LOC means that successes, failures, and events are the result of our own personal decisions and efforts, and external LOC means that our successes, failures, and events are the result of fate, luck, or other external factors. Research has shown that individuals with a high internal LOC are able to resist social influence because they accept more responsibility, they're active seekers of information, and they are achievement orientated. So to support this, Holland repeated Milgram's obedience study and measured whether participants had an internal or external locus of control. He found that 37% of internals managed to resist the pressure to obey and didn't continue the highest shock level, but only 23% of externals resisted the pressure to obey, and this is a significant difference. However, Twenge et al. Analysed data from American obedience studies performed over a 40-year period. I think that's a meta-analysis. The data showed that over this time span, people have become more resistant to obedience, but also more external. Another really important study is Moscovici's study into minority influence. His research found that consistency is necessary for minority influence. In the experiment, there were 2 Confederates and 6 naive participants. The group was shown several different slides that were different shades of blue. However, the Confederates were told to say that the slides were green to see if it would influence a minority group to say if the slides were green. So, Moscovici found that when green was said consistently, 8% of the trials, 8% of the trials, the minority got the majority to agree that the slides were green. When Confederates were inconsistent, the conformity of the majority groups decreased to 1% across trials. So, consistency is when people are first introduced to a minority with a differing view, they assume that the minority group is in error, that their idea is wrong. However, if a minority demonstrates consistency, others soon come to reassess the situation and consider the issue more carefully. Synchronic consistency is when both or all minorities agree and say the exact same thing. And diachronic consistency is that minorities continue to say the same thing over time. Commitment includes the augmentation principle. This is where minorities become hard to ignore when they threaten their own well-being and safety. When minority groups draw attention to themselves and take risks for their argument, this shows real commitment, suggesting certainty and confidence. Commitment involving a cost like disapproval, negative judgment, time and money is more likely to draw attention from the majority and persuade them to take their arguments seriously. Nemeth argues that flexibility is important to negotiate their position with the majority. If a minority is too rigid and refuse to compromise, they risk being perceived as dogmatic and narrow-minded. However, if a minority is too flexible and compromisable, they risk being seen as inconsistent and weak. So some compromise reflects a reasonable and pragmatic attitude, so a balance is required. A criticism of minority influence is that it lacks external validity and real-world applications. Tasks such as choosing the colour of a slide is unimportant and irrelevant, like Ash's line task in his conformity study. It's got really low mundane realism. It's far removed from the reality of real-life situations, including social influence such as political campaigning and jury decisions. Another criticism is by Bashir, I think it is, and they investigated why people resist social change even when it is needed. Researchers found that participants were less likely to behave in an environmentally friendly way because they didn't want to be associated with stereotypical environmentalists, like the extreme ones, and they didn't want to be considered part of a minority group. Their criticism is that research studies usually focus on clear and distinctive differences in group sizes between majorities and minorities. However, in real-life situations of social influence, the difference between groups is not as simple as just a matter of difference in the number of members. Often, groups differ in status, power, financial support, and public exposure. This is just a brief, very broken down example of social influence and social change using the steps to become the majority. You can read this if you want. There's so many things you could use as an example. You could do like the suffragettes movement as well. Yeah, there's loads of things, but this is just an example that my teacher used to explain it to us. But the key steps we've got is drawing attention, consistency, deeper processing, the augmentation principle, the snowball effect, and social cryptomnesia.